Events. I'm not going to talk much about events, but let's not forget that the oil market has always been bedeviled by events. CNN is loaded with pictures of Libya, and there are a few of them on this slide. In the background of this slide is an event in 1907 when there was a revolution in Baku in Azerbaijan, which wiped out half the world's production at the time. So that also had a big impact on the price. This is what I like to call Exxon World. Every year Exxon produces a report looking into the future. And I actually don't disagree with Exxon World. It's not a bad view. 1.2 billion vehicles in 2030, largest growth in diesel vehicles, mainly in China and Asia. 28% of vehicles still in the US, 17% in China, with quadrupling of the vehicles in China between 2010 and 2030. So 1.2, 1.5, whatever the forecast says, an awful lot of vehicles. But what strikes me about this view of the world is that most of those vehicles are still going to be powered by gasoline and diesel. Gasoline and diesel. Well, why is that? First of all, there's still going to be gasoline and diesel around at the right price. But secondly, there's an awful lot of inertia in systems, industrial systems and social systems. We have infrastructure for distributing diesel and gasoline. We have cars that run on it. We have vehicles that run on it. So all the inertia is there to keep this going until the price becomes prohibitive. This is also from Exxon World. This just shows you what we all read about, is that Europe and the USA demand growth for transport fuels is pretty flat, but Asia and Pacific are just taking off, and most of that is China and India. So the question is there enough oil for all that? And this is the snapshot of the model we produce for Toyota on a regular basis. And lest you think all these colors are just simply painted on, sitting in the green part of this slide are some 30,000 oil fields, future exploration, enhanced oil recovery, reserves growth, all the things that go into the mix of conventional crude oil. And there are also some 4,000, 3,500 gas fields in there for the natural gas liquids. We also have tar sands, shale oil, coal to liquids, gas to liquids, biofuels, and so on and so on. So it's as complete a liquid supply model as we could come up with. And we've been running this model now since 2005. And the forecasting error so far is pretty small, much, much less than a million barrels on 90, so much less than 1% so far. Crude oil still, even in 2030, is going to dominate transport fuels. 92% of transport fuel will be sourced ultimately from crude oil. What about the USA? We could break out all the USA components and look at them separately. And the interesting part of this slide is, well, two things actually. One is that the USA production of crude oil is due to increase, mainly through unconventional oil called shale oil, which is following on the back of unconventional gas, shale gas. And this is going to be quite big in the US, quite big in North America. Biofuels are also set to increase. Now, when I say biofuels, we'll talk a bit more about biofuels later, but this isn't corn ethanol, which is not a long-term viable solution to fueling things from biology. The second thing that's interesting about this is the large blue area of imported oil. Now, of course, this is almost all crude oil and crude oil products. And since roughly 2000, this is around 50 to 60% of US consumption. Now, the US consumption forecast is from the EIA, not necessarily my own forecast, but I just put the EIA forecast on here for you to see, to 2030, and then just roll it on to 2050 and see what happens. Now, in 2050, there's a 20 million barrel a day requirement for imported oil. But as we saw from the previous slide, by 2050, there will be a 25 million barrel a day drop in production, simply because crude oil is an exhaustible resource, and in the next 2 decades, we're going to reach the limit of it. So that means there's going to be some competition for that 20 million barrels of oil that isn't there anymore. And the idea that the US will be independent of imported oil is not really viable, in our view. This brings me to costs. This is a cost staircase which we use in the model. Obviously, the cheapest oil is in Iraq, Middle East, Venezuelan tar sands in Orinoco, deep water and shale oil, a bit expensive, but at current oil prices still feasible. And then we come into the more sort of expensive things like coal to liquids, gas to liquids, and corn ethanol. Now, corn ethanol without subsidy is definitely uneconomic. Corn ethanol in the US without a subsidy is not economic. You shouldn't be doing it from that point of view. Now, oil companies, when they make investments, they don't use the current oil price, of course, because $120 a barrel might not last terribly long. Last year, most oil companies are running on $65 a barrel as the forward price to say, well, this project goes or doesn't. So roughly now they're looking at $70, maybe $80. So things in deep water, not all projects are going ahead, simply because they don't pass the economic threshold for the company. Now, unrest in the Middle East, this has a huge impact on the market. I spoke about this last year at some length, so this is just one slide, really. The common themes here are we have a large youth population, what I called last year the angry young men. Well, this year we've seen the angry young men on the street. And it's a diverse group. It's not homogeneous. There's some from the Twitter generation, and there are some Islamists. There are just a whole spectrum of people. And we don't quite know how it's going to turn out. There are some common themes about exclusion, corruption, concentration of power, arbitrary authority, and repressive regimes, and so on. Those are fairly common, but underneath that, and sometimes more important locally, are local issues to do with a particular regime or the particular country, particular culture, particular socio-economic situation. So you can't just transport this Arab revolution thematically around the Middle East. The commonest theme here is large population of young men, and this is not going to go away for at least another decade. So we can look forward to more of the same now and again for at least another decade. So what does that mean for supply at risk? Well, in our modeling work, we can identify that spare capacity, global spare capacity for production, is a key factor in price. And once spare capacity drops below about 4–5% of total production, the market gets very anxious. There isn't enough spare capacity to handle the risk that's attached to supply. Taking Libya out, 2 million barrels a day, cut spare capacity below that threshold. So the price has responded, as we would expect it to, quite abruptly. And then there's an addition to the price, is that people are worried about other countries in the Middle East. What if Saudi Arabia went out? What if the trouble in Bahrain spread? So there's a risk premium in the price as well now. Most of the price effect, however, is the loss of spare capacity. About $20–30 a barrel in the price now is loss of spare capacity. Now, I've ringed here some of the other countries that have an impact on price. Iran. What's going to happen in Iran? Will they persist with their nuclear ambitions? Will they have their own revolution? Nigeria. Nigeria is a perennial problem. It's a potentially 3 million barrel a day country which is producing about 1.8. Why? Because part of the delta is shut in by activity, terrorist activity. Iraq. Iraq is still a very tenuous state. It's just beginning to emerge from 3 or 4 years of horrendous internal conflict. It may return, we hope not, but it may. And Venezuela. Venezuela is probably one of the largest future producers of crude oil, but no investment. Why no investment? Because of the local regime under Hugo Chavez is not conducive to a lot of foreign investment. But you take any one of those countries out further, and we will be into a completely different oil market. That's why the market's worried, because it can see trouble in a lot of places which could take another 1–2 million barrels a day out. And there's another reason for the risk. Simply the concentration of where that spare capacity is. It's really in one country right now, Saudi Arabia, and in the future it's going to be in 2 countries, assuming Iraq takes off. Around 2020 we'll be looking at Iraq and Saudi Arabia as the only holders of global spare production capacity. So now I'm going to talk about one of my favorite themes, which is gas. It so happens, just as the world is a little short of oil sometimes, it's never short of gas. When I joined an oil company many years ago, they used to say, God help you if you find gas when you drill a well looking for oil, because no one wanted it. And you nearly always found gas. Well, it's just 9 times out of 10 it would be a gas, not oil. So the world has a lot of gas, and it's not just conventional gas. There's a lot of unconventional gas, like shale gas, coal bed methane, and so on and so forth. And we've done a gas study for Toyota, and this is some of the results of that. Gas is going to peak, probably, but way out there, 2030, 2040, and we haven't even got all the gas in the mix yet. We haven't put all the discovered gas that may go in there. And it's interesting to see what effect that has had on price. First of all, particularly in the US, which is the freest market for gas, since 2005, when shale gas really started to come on, the Henry Hub gas price is decoupled from the oil price. After a long period, and roughly, you had energy parity with oil at the Henry Hub price. Suddenly, this glut of gas drove gas prices much, much lower than they had been. And the same has happened in Western Europe, in the UK, where they have a very similar trading hub, national balancing point hub, gas price at national balancing hub. National balancing point is substantially cheaper than long-term parity prices for gas from Russia, for example. So this suggests that if you went to gas, you'd be getting a cheaper source of energy. And you may use the gas in different ways. You can use it directly in the vehicle, or you can convert it into electricity first, and then use it in a vehicle as you wish. But gas is a very important fuel, and we have a lot of it. This is some work that Jan Kreider's team kindly did with us, and I just wanted to compare, let's take a Toyota Camry type vehicle, life cycle fuel use, and just see what it means for CO2 emissions and SOx and NOx and other things. And obviously CNG is indicated here in orange, so you can see it. But on the extreme side, you have E85, which is 85% ethanol fuel. On the other side, you have gasoline and diesel. So left side is hydrocarbon fuels from conventional oil and gas exploration. The right side is more sort of unconventional stuff. And on CO2, certainly, CNG is by far the best fuel to be using on a life cycle basis. When it comes to environmental impacts, this is just 25% replacement of US production, US consumption of transport fuels. Enormous requirement of land use. This year, 40% of the grain crop, corn crop, is being converted into ethanol. 40%. We need to convert all of it to ethanol if we're to get even halfway to satisfying the US's demand for transport fuel. Water use is another key issue for biofuels. It's horrendously consumption of water, whether it's ethanol, sugarcane, or switchgrass. It requires a lot of water, and that means, in the US at least, irrigation. Irrigation using, in the West, the Ogallala Aquifer, which is already severely depleted. And what about cost? I put here the cost per million BTUs for different fuels. Gasoline and diesel, roughly the same because they come from the same source, crude oil. At current gas prices in the US, compressed natural gas is actually cheaper to use than either of those two as a source of energy for transportation. And ethanol is by far the most expensive if you put in the subsidy. Without the subsidy, the cost is about 17, so roughly equivalent to tar sands. So a sustainable transport energy policy probably will be trying to encourage different things. First of all, greater efficiency of the internal combustion engine, not just the internal combustion engine itself, but also trying to make it use less fuel on the way to doing that. Compressed natural gas, you would try to encourage that because it's good for the environment and it's also cheap, and we have plenty of it, so it's sustainable. You would want to discourage things like corn ethanol, probably second-generation biofuels as well, because they consume far too much land, they consume far too much water, and they only produce barely more energy than you're consuming in producing them. So they're expensive, and they damage the environment, and they're not sustainable. So those would be my views on what we should be doing in energy and transport, compressed natural gas, and improve diesel and gasoline engine efficiency. Thank you very much.